Welcome back, everybody. We're about to get ready to start Module 3 of Art Appreciation today. Before we do that, I want to do a little bit of a recap of some of the main points from our previous module, and then also talk to you a little bit about what some of the objectives of our time together are for this module. In Module 2, you define the visual elements, and you also applied the vocabulary in descriptions of visual examples. So we're looking at artworks and we're trying to identify the elements of design. So in Module 3, then, we're going to add another aspect of developing this language or vocabulary of art making. We're going to evaluate the ways in which artists arrange those elements in their works. In other words, the practices of design or the principles of design. That's the term that we use to refer to these. So we can think about it as the elements being the what part of art making, and the principles being the how part of art making. Okay? Our goals are that at the end of this lesson, you'll be able to identify and discuss each principle of design. You'll also begin to be able to explain the role of evaluation, right? How do we evaluate whether something is successful or not successful? For example, it's also important that you will begin to examine the effects of cultural and historic perspectives on art. So we'll touch on that a little bit together. I think we need to really consider the roles of museums and the role of the art critic, who is actually a professional art viewer and a professional art evaluator. The terms that we're going to discuss are all a natural part of perception. I think that that's really important to know, and they apply to all forms of art as well. So we'll look at a selection of paintings and sculptures, but monuments, memes, and social media graphics, graphic design, these elements and principles apply to any of those visual modes of communication. They are also directly related to our own natural processes of perception. We all have an inherent sense of what we think works and what we think doesn't work. Learning how to see and learning how to analyze the principles of design is only going to build an inherent and strengthen an inherent visual literacy that we all have. And it's going to help us to understand more about how art communicates, right? It makes us better at observing and at looking critically at the objects that we see every day. And so critically, again, doesn't mean criticism. It means a deeper level of seeing as opposed to looking, and through seeing, a deeper level of engagement with the artworks. Art in the context that we are beginning to understand takes thought, planning, reflection, and effort. And we call this a process, the creative process, right? So it doesn't just appear out of nowhere, not often anyways. Looking at a work of art, we see the end result of the creative process, but we don't necessarily see its steps. And as we evaluate, as we get into naming what we see and interpreting artworks, we're going to have to make a leap away from a leap that is based more on what we see rather than what the artist can tell us. And we'll start to get an understanding of what interpretation really entails, right? When we start to come to an understanding of a work of art. So not being able to see the steps, but our job in looking at things as viewers is to try to understand at least the pieces and the way that they've been put together. Okay, maybe a good way to summarize that. So we don't see the ideas being generated. We don't see the selection of materials. We don't see the planning. We don't see the reflection. We don't see the search for solutions or the problems that come up in the making of the work. The constant reflection on the development process, experimentation, risk-taking, dealing with one's fears, and most importantly, persistence and concentration that it takes to see a work of art through to completion. So I want to take a look a little bit at some artist sketchbooks. We haven't had a chance to really talk about that yet. So I just want to briefly take a look at the example that you have on your screen right now and talk about how those sketchbooks can offer a glimpse into the early steps of the creative process. I think a sketchbook performs a lot of functions for artists. It's kind of like a journal that we keep to make drawings and to record observations of the world and also ideas for new works. So the sketches could be accompanied by notes. If you've seen any of the sketchbooks, the many sketchbooks of Leonardo da Vinci, those pages are full of drawings and revisions and details and also note taking about what was being seen and what was being understood through what was being seen. So writings can be included in your sketchbooks. You can also include drawings of other works of art, studies for technical information, and also I like to put just quotes that I find inspiring in mine as well. And so altogether, a record, a sort of a journal type visual record, also verbal, of what it's like to move through life as an artist and as a maker, someone who makes things and responds to culture through making things. So the level of completion of imagery on a sketchbook can really range from fully rendered studies to like loose sketches to brief and incomplete studies that were really maybe only about observing or understanding a small portion of something. And what I love about the studies of the gentian moth, birds, cats, and interlacing motif that we see here in the example by Giorgio di Giovanni is that there's a little bit of everything there happening on the page. I mean, I see oftentimes my students think that the sketchbook should be a place where perfection happens, but we can see from the way the drawings here reflect a thinking process or a curiosity about many different things. Each one having somewhat different amount of time put in, perhaps, right? So it's not really about perfection, but about exploration. And it takes a little bit of courage, to put that down, at least in the beginning, I think, until you realize that the sketchbook is exactly meant for that. It's a place to put your ideas, a place to explore your questions. And so as artists begin new projects, they may turn to their sketchbooks for inspiration or for preliminary drawings. And these initial drawings are ways for the artist to explore questions and ideas about how the final artwork should look. These questions can include decisions related to using some or all of the formal elements of design we have used in the last chapter. The thinking process includes questions in two basic categories, right? So the process of creation, two basic sort of areas of questioning. One, choosing which of the visual elements to use. And as we saw, not every artwork needs to include every visual element. It's a selection process. And then the second one is organizing the elements to convey the artist's intentions. So the sketchbook page has little to no organization. It's literally a response and a usage of what space is left over after the first drawing takes place, right? So not so much, especially in the example we're looking at about organization. But in the final artwork, we are really looking at the ultimate organization of those elements as a way that the artist decided they had arrived at the best stopping point where those two things worked best together to communicate their intentions, right? So the principles, how we put things together, the elements, what we're putting together, those things circulate around the idea that the artist wants to convey. And then the composition, right, is the organization of those visual elements. And your book refers to it as the composition in two-dimensional design sense. I would suggest that it relates to three-dimensional design, to video art, to any of the art forms that we have talked about or will talk about over the course of our time together. And it's interesting to me that composition is also a musical term, right? So if you think about the way a musician or a composer or a conductor might think about arranging all the different elements of the architecture or all the elements of the song, there's a lot of crossover between music terms and art terms. So just a couple of basic sort of categories to understand before we get started with Module 3, and a quick definition on composition. So we're going to get into composition, the principles of design, and how those are approaches to composition as we begin Module 3 together. We'll see you soon.